in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 17 and 25 through 29. Did any of my narrative lectionary study folk read between? No? Okay. Well, let me tell you, I tried to summarize this, and I feel like the summary in Quinema was longer than my sermon, because we are going so far. We were with David last week. So, King David was just anointed king last week, and he was moving the Ark of the Covenant. Killian came home and said, David moved a boat. It's like, yeah, good job. Like, the Ark, he got it. Right, it's on a boat. But I was really proud because he listened to the story, right? He's like, David moved a boat this week. But so David moved the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to establish in Jerusalem a center of worship that the entire kingdom could unite around. Okay? David, man after God's own heart, we all know those stories. David tried his best to be a good king and to keep the kingdom united. And the kingdom stayed united through all of David's reign. But there were some cracks beginning to show because David, unfortunately, did show some favoritism to certain tribes over other tribes. But when Solomon, David's son, came into power, the kingdom was still united. Solomon took David's partiality to a whole nother level. So Solomon was a member of the tribe of Judah, and he felt that his tribe was the best tribe. And so the other 11 tribes, he forced into servitude, forced labor upon them so that those other 11 tribes had to build him majestic cities and places to store up all of his horses that he collected and all of the gold and the silver that he collected. And so he made life rather unbearable for the majority of Israel. Beyond that, beyond Solomon's just being unkind to his subjects, he also began to marry foreign wives in order to amass more and more riches. Which wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact he then built altars to their gods, which wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact he then began to worship their gods as well. And so in the midst of Solomon's reign, God tells Solomon, the kingdom is going to divide. When you are gone, the kingdom will divide, because you have chosen to be a terrible king. That's my paraphrase, of course. And so Solomon's son, Rehoboam, comes into power. And Rehoboam is where we are picking up today. We are going to read about Rehoboam stepping into power and the choice that he has at the very beginning of his reign to either unite the kingdom back together or allow it to be divided. So we're picking up in 1 Kings chapter 12. Pardon me. Rehoboam went to Shemesh, for all Israel had come to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt, and they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam said to them, go away for 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer this people? They answered him, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. But he disregarded the advice that the older men gave him, and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? The young men who had grown up with him said to him, thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Thus you should say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had said, come to me again the third day. The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the younger men. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word which the Lord had spoken to Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, what share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David. So Israel went away to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. We're going to jump to verse 25 now. Then Jeroboam built Shemesh in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Peniel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So, before this text, Solomon had an option to stop his ways. If he had listened to God, had he stopped the forced labor, had he stopped worshiping the false gods, had he stopped building altars to those gods, he would have been able to keep the kingdom together. He chose not to listen to God. Rehoboam is presented with really the same opportunity, an opportunity to undo the damage that his father had done and to create a kingdom that was united. The people, led by Jeroboam, came to him and said, lighten our load, show us mercy, and we will be loyal and faithful and serve you forever. That seems like a really good option to me, right? Lighten our load, show us mercy, offer us some grace, and we're going to be your people. And Rehoboam doesn't listen to them. Instead, he says, I'm going to make everything worse for you. I'm going to cause you more pain, more hardship. And the people, they're not going to take it. Here in verses 16 and 17, we hear him say, worry about yourself, Rehoboam, because we're done. And they take their tents and they leave. They are no longer his people. They have no desire to serve a king who won't listen to them or God. And so instead they serve Jeroboam. I wish I could make Jeroboam into a hero in this story, because in a lot of ways he is. While Solomon was still reigning, God came to Jeroboam and said, you are going to become a king. Once Solomon dies, Rehoboam's going to take over, but you're going to be a king to 10 of the 12 tribes. The majority of the people are going to be yours. Jeroboam, here at the beginning, goes to Rehoboam and says, lighten our load and we'll be your people. Jeroboam has the opportunity to just be king outright. But instead he says, I'll forgo being king. I don't need to be king if you will lighten the load so that we can be one kingdom. He's willing to give up the power and the prestige in order to keep the kingdom united. But when that doesn't happen, Jeroboam does become king. And for a while, he's a good king. He has listened to God and to God's promises. But then doubt and fears start to creep into his head, and they start to gain control over him. He's worried that the people are going to turn back to Rehoboam. He's worried that he's going to lose his power and his might. And so out of fear, instead of trusting God, he builds golden calves. We've heard this story before. It didn't go well the first time. It's not going to go well this time. He builds these golden calves and says, "These are your gods. This is who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery." He stopped listening to God. He stopped trusting in God. And ultimately, it was Jeroboam's demise. Both these kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdom that are divided up here in this text, they go through king after king after king in the coming books of the Bible. They go through war after war after war. They're occupied by other nations over and over again. They don't see the prosperity and the joy that was promised them because they stopped listening. The kings stopped listening to God, and they stopped listening to their people. They were so worried about what they wanted, about their own power, their own prestige, about things going the way they wanted them to go, that they ceased listening to God. There's a book, it's called Doing Good is Simple. And I think the author's name is Chris something. It's in my office, so if you want to see it, I'm not trying to steal this man's work in any way. So he runs a nonprofit organization that partners with different orphanages and other corporations in Africa to try and serve them. And he is visiting one of these orphanages, and the kids at this orphanage in Africa, they're throwing rocks at the wall of this really nice building. And it's chipping the paint and it's falling away, and nobody's stopping the kids from doing this. In fact, they're encouraging the children to throw these rocks at the outside of this building and ruin this building. And so he asked, "Why? What's going on?" And the guy who runs the orphanage, he says, "Oh, well, the next group will be here in about 2 weeks, and they'll want to paint the outside of it again, so we got to make it look bad so they can feel good about themselves." That's a true story, okay? I know it's funny, but it's actually a true story. These people going in on a mission trip, telling everybody what they need. You need your building painted. That's what you need. Instead of stopping to listen and say, "How can we serve you today? How can we actually help?" Because they don't need another paint coat on their building. They need friends who care for them, who build relationships. They need sustainable income in their communities. They need help in other ways. They don't need another layer of paint. I thought of that story as I thought of Rehoboam this week. Here are the people in front of him telling him exactly what they need. "We need your mercy." And instead, he slaps another coat of paint on it. He was a bad king because he failed to listen to what the people needed. Jeroboam didn't have the same problem. He had a different one. He failed to listen to God, to trust that God would bring about all that God promised. He was so worried about his own power, about his own control, about his own hopes that he didn't listen to God. When my nephew was 4-ish, we went to the zoo. And Brian has a pet peeve at the zoo. It is kids calling animals by the wrong name. Okay? It is the scientist in him. He can't handle it. So we're looking at these beautiful lions at the zoo, and Blake is like, look at the tigers. Brian says, no, they're lions, Blake. No, they're tigers. And this goes back and forth, right? Because it's a 4-year-old and Brian, who's a brick wall, arguing. Lions, tigers, lions, tigers. Finally, Blake puts his hands on the side of Brian's face and says, listen to my words, Brian. It's a tiger. I've been thinking about that with Jeroboam this week. Jeroboam was so focused on what he wanted things to be. And maybe he was right. Maybe the people would have returned to Rehoboam if they kept going to Jerusalem. Maybe he would have lost his kingdom. He could have been right. But he was so busy worrying about that, worrying about the fact that he thought he was right, that he didn't listen to God's words. He didn't trust in what God was saying. We've been talking this narrative year over how we're going to figure it out. How we're going to figure out how to be God's people. How we're going to figure out to create God's kingdom here on earth. And I think the key to figuring it out is to really listen. To listen to God and trust in God. And to listen to God's people as well. They say that the majority of the time people aren't actually listening because they're too busy thinking about what they're going to say next. I think that's true with God too. We're too busy thinking about our plans and our desires and what we're going to do next that we're not actually listening to what God is calling us to. We're so busy thinking about how we can be helpful and how we can show mercy that we're not actually listening to the people in front of us telling us what they need. I was very frustrated with this text when I started a couple of weeks ago with it. It's just too much for one sermon. I didn't understand why we were focusing on both Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Why couldn't we do one and then the other next week? But they actually do go hand in hand. If we are going to figure out what it means to be God's children and what it means to live in God's ways, then we have to listen to both God and God's people. So I encourage you this week to go out into the world, not with your own hopes and your own dreams and your own agendas and your own desire to be right and powerful, but with hearts and minds ready to listen to where God is taking you and ready to serve in the ways that people need it most. Amen.